They were dragged into town squares, their heads forcibly shaved, their clothes torn, their faces smeared with black tar or swastikas. Crowds jeered. Children threw stones. Liberation had arrived. But for these women, it marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. Across Europe in 1944 and 1945, as Nazi forces retreated and Allied troops rolled in, a wave of vengeance swept through newly freed cities. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers, so-called horizontal collaborators, became easy targets. In France, Norway, and beyond, thousands were publicly humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Their crime? Intimacy with the enemy. Yet their stories weren't all betrayal. Some were lovers, others victims of coercion or rape, many simply accused without evidence. While the world celebrated freedom, these women became symbols of shame. This is the disturbing and often forgotten story of how liberation's light cast long, cruel shadows, especially on those who could not defend themselves. During the World War II, much of Europe fell under Nazi occupation. France, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands all lived under German rule for years. Daily life changed dramatically. Rationing, curfews, censorship, fear, and constant surveillance became the norm. Some civilians resisted. Others tried to survive by cooperating, and a small number, mostly women, entered into relationships with German soldiers. This act, whether out of love, survival, or coercion, became known as horizontal collaboration. The term, dripping with judgment, suggested betrayal, not just of country, but of morality and womanhood itself. These relationships stirred deep resentment among locals, especially those who had lost family members to Nazi violence or humiliation. By the time Allied forces liberated these countries in 1944 and 1945, the hatred and frustration built up under occupation had found a target. Many saw these women as traitors, even if they had done nothing illegal. With the fall of Nazi power came a chance for revenge, and these women, vulnerable and often unprotected, were among the first to suffer. The lines between guilt and innocence blurred quickly. In the chaos of liberation, justice was not always handed down in courtrooms. It came in the streets, with scissors, fists, and shame. After France was liberated from Nazi control in 1944, the country exploded with emotion, joy, anger, and the need to punish those seen as traitors. One of the harshest reactions was aimed at women accused of having romantic or sexual relationships with German soldiers during the war. This wave of revenge was called the Wild Purge, or épuration sauvage. Across towns and villages, angry crowds took justice into their own hands. Around 20,000 women were dragged into public squares, where their heads were shaved to mark them as traitors. Many were forced to walk half-naked through the streets. Some had swastikas painted on their faces or bodies. People threw insults, spit, and even hit them, while others stood by and watched. One famous photo taken in the town of Chartres shows a young woman named Simone Tussaud. Her head is shaved, and she's holding her baby, fathered by a German soldier, as people glare at her. That image came to represent the shame and suffering many women faced during this time. But it didn't stop with public shaming. It's believed around 6,000 people, men and women, were killed in the chaos without any proper trials. While men were often punished for political reasons, women were usually punished simply for who they had been seen with. Many of the people handing out this street justice weren't saints either. Some had cooperated with the Nazis themselves and used the Purge to cover their own tracks. Although France later held official trials to deal with real collaborators, the damage from this early, emotional purge had already been done. And for many of the women involved, the pain and shame never went away. France wasn't the only country where women were punished after the war for relationships with German soldiers. In Norway, these women were called Tyskertøser, or German girls. About 50,000 Norwegian women were believed to have had relationships with German troops, and many were treated harshly after liberation. Some were beaten or publicly humiliated, but others faced even worse. Thousands were arrested and sent to internment camps without trial. One of the most well-known camps was on Hovedøya, an island near Oslo. Conditions were poor, and women were kept there for months or even years. Their only crime, having children with German fathers or falling in love during a time of war. Other countries followed similar patterns. In the Netherlands, Belgium, and Serbia, women were also paraded, shaved, or imprisoned. While the scale was smaller than in France, the message was the same. These women were seen as traitors and a stain on national pride. Often no one stopped to ask whether these women had chosen their relationships freely. Some had fallen in love. Others had been raped or manipulated. Still, they all faced the same punishment. In every case, it was their bodies and their reputations that paid the price for a nation's shame. Why did so many people turn so quickly and violently on these women? The reasons weren't just about love or betrayal. They were personal, emotional, and often political. Many people had suffered terribly during the war. They'd lost family members, faced hunger, or lived in fear under Nazi rule. When the Germans were finally gone, all that anger needed somewhere to go. And women seen with German soldiers became easy targets. They were visible, vulnerable, and often had no way to defend themselves. Some of the punishers were members of the resistance. Others were ordinary neighbors. But not all of them were heroes. In fact, some had worked with the Nazis themselves. By attacking these women, they hoped to shift attention away from their own actions and prove their loyalty. There was also a strong element of gender and control. These women were punished not just for who they were with, but for stepping outside the roles society expected. In a time when male pride and national identity were deeply wounded, punishing women became a way to restore both. It wasn't about justice. It was about revenge, shame, and regaining power, and the women paid the price for it. Behind the crowds, the shouting, and the shaved heads were real women, each with their own story, many of them tragic and misunderstood. Some of the accused truly had relationships with German soldiers. A few were in love. Others exchanged companionship for food, protection, or shelter. Many were young and vulnerable, trying to survive in a world filled with danger. And not all had a choice. Some were coerced or raped. Still others were falsely accused by jealous neighbors, rivals, or people settling personal scores. Simone Tussaud, the woman in the famous Chartres photo, was just 23 years old when she was punished. Her baby was the child of a German soldier she'd been involved with. After being shaved and paraded through the streets, she was never able to rebuild her life. She died by suicide just a few years later. In Norway, some women who had children with Germans were separated from them. The children were labeled war children and faced bullying and discrimination for years. Their mothers were often left isolated, unemployed, and marked for life. Some women tried to speak out later, A few gave interviews or wrote about their experiences, but many stayed silent, too ashamed or afraid to revisit the past. Society rarely welcomed them back. In many cases, their families, communities, and governments simply turned away. These were not war criminals. They weren't soldiers, but they became symbols of betrayal and suffered the full weight of a nation's pain and fury. The punishments these women faced weren't just physical, they were deeply symbolic. Shaving a woman's head wasn't about removing hair, it was about stripping her of dignity, beauty, and identity. In many cultures, long hair is tied to femininity and pride. Taking it away was a public message. You are no longer one of us. Some women were forced to wear signs or had swastikas painted on their bodies. Others were marched half naked through the streets. These weren't random acts. They were meant to humiliate, to control, and to shame. They turned the female body into a battlefield, a place to act out national anger and moral judgment. Men who collaborated with the enemy were often executed or imprisoned. Women, on the other hand, were punished in ways that targeted their sexuality and appearance. It showed a cruel double standard, one where betrayal was judged not by actions alone, but by gender. After the chaos of liberation settled, some governments tried to bring order. In France, formal trials were held for major collaborators, but for the thousands of women punished during the Wild Purge, there was little justice. Most never saw a courtroom. Their public shaming was the only sentence they received, delivered by mobs, not judges. In Norway, the government took more formal action, but not necessarily kinder. Around 5,000 women were arrested for relationships with Germans. Many were sent to camps, like the one on Hovedøya, even though they had committed no crime. In 2003, decades later, the Norwegian government finally apologized for the way these women were treated. In France, no official apology has ever been made. For most of these women, the pain followed them for life. They were labeled as traitors, avoided by neighbors, and cut off from society. Their stories were buried in silence, too uncomfortable, too complicated, and too painful to face. Looking back, it's clear that many of these women were punished not for treason, but for breaking unspoken social rules. They were easy targets in a time of chaos, vulnerable, visible, and mostly powerless. What happened to them wasn't justice. It was revenge, shaped by shame, fear, and deeply rooted ideas about gender and purity. Their stories force us to think carefully about how we judge people during times of crisis. Is it fair to punish someone based on rumors or emotions? Can we ever really know the full story behind someone's choices in war? What happened to these women is a warning. It shows how quickly society can turn on its own, especially when it needs someone to blame. And it reminds us that real justice is calm, careful, and fair, not fueled by hate or pride. When the dust of war settles, how we treat the most vulnerable says everything about who we really are. The liberation of Europe was supposed to bring freedom, but for thousands of women, it brought shame and suffering. Their stories were buried for decades, hidden behind silence and judgment. Today, as we remember their pain, one question remains. When justice turns into vengeance, who will be brave enough to stop it?